and mellow greetings to all. You were tuned in to Frivolous Gravitas. Our wonderful listeners worldwide on iTunes, Google Podcasts, YouTube, and wherever else you may have found yourself dialed into this very special episode of Frivolous Gravitas. To all of you, it is with tremendous honor that I'm granted the privilege of introducing today's guest and star of the show to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, also known as the Palestinian problem, which I object to, in name, I mean. We've been itching to cover this subject for a while now, and before we get that out of the way, please let me introduce our guest, expert joining us today from across the pond. Professor Raphael Cohen-Almagor hails from his professorship at University of Hull, where he is chair of politics and director of the Middle East Study Group. After earning his PhD at Oxford, he has made himself an astoundingly prolific participant to modern scholarship and social discourse as a world-renowned voice against oppression, abuse, coercion, and violence of many sorts. He has demonstrated a lifelong dedication to serve a greater social good with his breadth of expertise as a fervently outspoken advocate for truth and reconciliation, further demonstrated by his donated time to be with us here today. Dr. Cohen-Almagor has written on heavily weighted subjects with our listeners will find familiar to this channel, but more specifically, he's published academic papers on such internet regulation, cyberbullying, end-of-life rights and euthanasia, socio-political pieces analyzing and dissecting Israel-Palestine conflict, and most recently, he's released his newest book titled Just, Reasonable Multiculturalism, published by Cambridge University Press, and we've got a separate episode entirely for dedicated just to cover some of my questions and an introduction and some of his motivations on writing that book. So his list of merits could consume our entire broadcast, such as the painful reality of all our mortal endeavors. I'll have to be unfair to the distinguished professor and neglect to mention all of his achievements and accolades in their entirety in this brief introduction. So I strongly urge our listeners to check in the notes of the description for links to more of his work. Today, I'd like to get us started into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And to do that, I think we might want to give a little bit of background to what we're discussing, some of the key players and some of the roles of those players. So geography might be the easiest place to start, because I believe it was from the two-state solution that most of our talks and negotiations have been trying to move forward. I don't think anybody's seriously considering a one-state solution as a proper solution, to my knowledge. I could be wrong. But maybe to take us into the fray, you could discuss, you could elucidate on who's involved here. Who are the Palestinian people, for starters? Because a lot of people are making claims that there are no Palestinians because, you know, the Britons took over from the Ottoman Empire and then gave it to the Jews after World War. There were no people, or, you know, there's a lot of banter and common talk about what's what in the region. So to start us off, who are the Palestinian people and who are the Israeli people? And then maybe we'll get into the political groups after, like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the government.
Okay, thank you very much for this. I don't want to trouble you with a very long lecture about the roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We don't have the time for this. And I would just give some snapshots for your listeners, our listeners, to understand what the context is. First of all, I want to start by saying that there are no angels in this story. If you are looking for angels, you have to look elsewhere. That's the wrong place. Bye-bye. What we are talking about is two people who have justified claims on a very small piece of land with a lot of emotions. And unfortunately, because it's so protracted conflict, the more that it lasted, the more complicated it becomes, because there's more violence involved, more blood has been shed, and therefore the emotions run wilder. And that's great pity, because there are many, many similarities at the end of the day between the Israelis and the Palestinians. we have to go back to history in order to understand the roots and ideological, religious, political, sociological roots to the conflict. So according to the Jewish belief, for the past 4,000 years, some people say 5,000 years, there were Jews in that corner of the world that has different names, Canaan, Palestine, Palestina, Israel, Eretz Israel. Since the biblical times, there was Jewish presence in that corner of the world. The Arabs came to that corner in the 7th century, during the Arab Empire, when they took over large chunks of Asia, Africa, and Europe. And because if you look at the map, you'll see that Palestine is situated in the intersection of three continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia. You can understand that any empire who respected itself wanted to have Palestine because it's such a geopolitical place and such weighty importance for commerce, for waging wars, for defending your empire, and so on. So the Arab came to Palestine in the 7th century, 644, I think, and they never left. So this is where the two people found themselves in the same place. So there was, from the 7th century, there was quite substantive, far more substantive than Jewish. There was quite substantive Arab population in Palestine, and there was a small Jewish population in Palestine. And it stays like this until the 19th century. So there were not many problems, not to the extent that we see now. So there will be skirmishes, and sometimes there will be misunderstanding or rivalry between the two parties. But there was not that I can think of a well-known war between Jews and Arabs in Palestine at the time. And in any event, everything, all the time, Palestine was conquered by another party, a third party that, of course, seeks public order. All empires want public order because, lack of public order is not good for your empire. In the 19th century, there were pogroms, meaning violent persecutions of Jews in Eastern Europe, primarily in Russia and Ukraine. And to evade the pogroms that cost lives and cost communities, people decided they need to leave. They had enough. They could not live in fear for such a long time. So the impetus was the pogroms. And so it happens that the pogroms came at the same time when there was a great man leading a life in Vienna, quite in peace. I mean, Vienna was very anti-Semitic, but that person was an assimilated Jew. He didn't care that much about Judaism. But later in his life, when he was in his 30s, that person saw injustice very close to him. And because he was a just person, he decided that he's going to do something about it. That person's name was Theodor Herzl. And Theodor Herzl was an ingenious sort of a guy, a man with vision. And he decided that he will task himself to try to solve the Jewish problem in Europe. And he convened the first Zionist convention in Basel. His main allies were the people from Russia and Ukraine who wanted to evade the pogroms that I mentioned. And then we start to see waves of immigration, what the Israelis call aliyah, which means to ascend, ascending to Israel, living in Europe and starting a life in Israel.
Did Herzl do this via pamphlets, or did he just kind of stoke the fires? How did he get the word of this?
He was a brilliant organizer. He was an orator, one of the brilliant orators ever. And he was a journalist.
Oh, okay.
And he was a person of means. not his own, his wife's, which he spent on traveling to meet the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, to meet the British, wherever he could meet in London. He went to Prussia, he went to Russia, he went all over the place where to meet with leaders of the world that for some reason they were willing to see him. You know, it's quite a task to ask for an audience with the leader of a country. And he was able to see quite a few of them. And he tried to, because he was not a religious Jew, he just wanted to solve the problem. So he was looking for a piece of land. So, you know, there were ideas, Uganda, Madagascar, Sinai Desert in Egypt. I mean, he couldn't care less. But, you know, all the Zionists told him, come on, the only thing that really unites us together is Zion. Zion means Israel. It's one of the eldest names for Israel. So,
was there a focus on Jerusalem at that time too?
You know, the name Zion has different meanings. So, from the small to the large. So Zion is the name of a mountain, Mount Zion. Mount Zion is in Jerusalem. So because of the importance of that mountain, then later it developed that the city of Jerusalem is called Zion. And later Israel is called Zion. So the name Zion has three different meanings, from the small to the larger.
Could the weakening, the slow weakening of the Ottoman Empire at that time had contributed to this being a more viable project?
Yes. He spoke to the Sultan, but he also spoke to the British.
Yeah.
And to anyone else who could help. He just wanted a solution. Anyone who was willing to offer some sort of reprieve for the Jews, he was willing to engage and talk to them. He would talk to anybody, just to see that Europe is not going to strike more victims among Jews. So Jews have to take control over their own destiny. They have to be their own defenders. They should not rely on others, because the others are doing very poor jobs in defending them. So the only way is to exit Europe. And as I said, he could not care less where to. But his idea about Uganda actually was passed successfully, was able to pass the motion in the Zionist Congress. But people told him, you know, it was passed because he didn't want to humiliate you, because we appreciate you so much. But actually, you know, stop speaking like this, because nobody's going to go to Uganda. And he said, okay, well, you know, Jews are going to suffer. He was a visionary. It's going to be problematic. It's not going to be easy, but if that's what you want, that's what you're going to have. But this is where he put his destiny on Palestine. And the guy in 42 years, I think he died when he was 42, early 40s. In 42 years of life, he did things that the vast majority of us don't do in a much, you know, longer lifetime. He was an amazing character. So the first Aliyah started in the second half of the 19th century. And the first Aliyah was defeated by poverty, by the malaria, by the heat, by working very hard on agriculture. Agriculture is one of the most difficult things you can do in your life.
Yeah, that's pretty standard for establishing colonies, is the low success rate.
Yeah, and they never worked in agriculture. Yeah. You know, they were petty commerce, you know, working in the markets. So the first Aliyah, 25,000 people, they were defeated, they left. The majority of them left. And there were only 10,000 people. However, the second Aliyah, the second immigration, was extremely important. Again, from the same corner of the world, Eastern Europe, Poland, Russia, Ukraine. And it was so important because, so it happened that in that wave of immigration, some years later, after the first attempt, there were very important people. And first and foremost was David Ben-Gurion, who later became the first prime minister of Israel, the George Washington of Israel. And these two people, Theodor Herzl and David Ben-Gurion, are the two key figures to understand the success of Zionism. Because both of them were visionaries and both of them were doers, people who do stuff, and they were leaders. So the second Aliyah did not succumb to all the obstacles, and the majority of people stay there. Now they have the backbone of leadership to push the entire project forward. Then came other aliyahs, and of course the largest aliyahs, waves of immigration, started in 1933. And guess why? That's the year that Hitler came to power. So some Jews understood what's going to happen, and they flee. And this is when Jews came with large numbers to Palestine. And this is when the Arabs became very, very concerned. Because as long as they were small, they were weak. But now they came with tens of thousands, or sometimes even hundreds of thousands. There was one wave of aliyah of 250,000. That was problematic. Hey, what are you doing here? Now, in 1922, the British took over from the Ottoman Empire. Now there was the British Mandate. And the British, for them, public order is extremely important. So all they want is just to preserve the peace. So they found themselves in the midst of all these clashes between the Arabs on the one hand and the Jews on the other. And they tried to establish some sort of modus vivendi, of peace between the two. But it didn't go very well, especially when you have such a pressure in the face of Nazism that is coming quite close. I mean, Al-Alamein, Africa, not very far from Palestine. So there was a lot of pressure going on.
They also had their backs to the wall, like they couldn't go back. So it was kind of like Cortez burning his ships once they landed, right?
They didn't think of coming back. There's no way that they're going to go back to the Nazis now. It was very bad during the 30s, and the first rumors about the death camps started to come in 42. So no,
just solidified their resolve.
Solidified their resolve, but bear in mind, it's not easy. These are immigrants. Mm-hmm. I'm an immigrant myself, and now I live in Britain. I can tell you it's one of the hardest things you can do in your life. And they didn't speak the same language. They came from different countries with different languages. Hebrew was not spoken at that time. Hebrew was just emerging. And many people came without any Hebrew. And when you don't have the language, and you come from Eastern Europe, like Winnipeg, minus 25, minus 30.
And unlivable. I don't care what the settlers here did. It's unlivable.
Unlivable, yeah. And so moving from minus 30 to plus 40, not easy. Mm-hmm. Plus the Arabs, plus the British. I mean, there's a lot of going on, and it was not easy. 47, 29th of November 1947, a very important event took place in the United Nations, when the United Nations acknowledged their strife over the Jews in Europe and acknowledged the need for the Jews to have a home, a Jewish home, a state. And the decision, it's called the partition decision. Decision was to partition Palestine to two states. One was called the Arab state, so no Palestine. Palestine is a development that came in the 1960s when the PLO was established, and they wanted to differentiate themselves from the rest of the Arabs. There are about 25 Arab countries. So that's the way that they wanted to differentiate and have their own character, their own personality, their own identity. So Palestine is a later development that came in the 60s. But if someone wants to call him Palestine, I cannot tell you not to call him Palestine, as I wouldn't dare to call you American.
Well, it's a weird term as it is, because its roots run from the word Philistine, do they not? In Herodotus, when he's describing the area. And it doesn't really have anything to do with Arabs, as it is, until it was informed by current history.
It has to do with the name of the place. So
yes.
The name of the place.
The Romans called the area Palestina, which was
Palestine, and they are the native name of Palestine. So they are called the Palestinians. But the idea in 47 was to split this piece of land to two, and one was called Israel, the Jewish state, and one was called the Arab state. That was the idea. If there is a point of time that if I will have some sort of a time tunnel, time machine, that's the day that I would like to live, the day of the partition plan. Because people say that the jubilation that was seen in Palestine by the Jews at that time was unseen before in any other place on earth. There were people dancing on the streets. It was night now. It was evening when it's all happening in Israel time. And people were just dancing in the streets. Hope for sovereignty, hope for taking control, hope for statehood. And that was wonderful. The problem is that as this idea was cherished by the Jews, it was vehemently rejected by the Arabs. They detested it.
I think that's the first problem too, right? Is because when you have a UN resolution of the United Nations saying this is so, and then you've got one party exuberant and jubilant and, you know, happy about it, and the other party denying it outright, it's hard for them to make any claims moving on. Every time the UN makes a resolution after it, it's predicated on the fact that the first one is accepted when it wasn't, right? So that's sort of part of the problem today, if I'm not mistaken.
It seems like all these plans that have been going on since the 19th century all had an element of, we'll deal with the people that are already there when we get there. And so this seems to be a more official version of that. Now we have to deal with that, and here's how we're going to deal with it, and good enough, let's move on.
Well, at least twice before, there was the idea of partition. There was the Balfour Declaration, which is the Balfour Letter of early century of the 20th century, and then there was the Peel Report, Lord Peel, that was devised to try to find a solution to the Jewish-Arab conflict in Palestine. And all of them spoke about dividing the land into two, Arab and Jewish. The problem was that the Arabs felt themselves far stronger than the Jews in any way, in any aspect that you can imagine, primarily in terms of numbers. You know, numbers are important. So in 47, 48, there were about 1.2 million Arabs in Palestine and about 600,000 Jews. So half. So if you take it as one, so it's 1/3 Jewish, 2/3 Arab. And the Arabs felt that they are the majority, they should have their way, they should have their say. And they didn't want to accept that they have to find a solution to what they perceive as a European problem. Why you, Europe, impose your problem on us? You know, you have to sort out your own problems. Why should us be blameworthy for this? Why we should take problem of anti-Semitism in Europe and bring it to Palestine? It's unacceptable. So they rejected the idea, and they continuously rejected the idea. And from 47 until 48, there was skirmishes, a lot of infighting, a lot of terrorism, a lot of violence between the two parties. And the British were licking the wounds from World War II. Remember, England was demolished in World War II. They had to rebuild Britain. So,
were those conflicts sanctioned by the political parties that were governing the Israelis and the Palestinians, or the Arabs, I should say? Or was it just fringe groups that were going off and committing acts of violence against the other groups?
Partisans.
No, we didn't call them partisans. I mean, it's all, propaganda language.
Yeah.
So the Israelis called the Arabs, called them gangs. And the Arabs call the Israeli undergrounds, they call them terrorist organization. So the terminology is, we can have a discussion about terminology, but not today. The fact of the matter is that the British were licking the wounds, and they say, okay, enough is enough. We have to look now inward to ourselves. Britain matters, and we need to fix Britain. And now Palestine is liability. We are leaving. So they announced that they are leaving, and Palestine. And then there was the question whether to declare statehood or not. And, sometimes you need to have a leader in place. And David Ben-Gurion understood that he needs to seize the moment, not to wait. And by the way, some of his friends and colleagues told him not to do that because they knew what's going to happen. War is going to happen. And he said, no, we have to seize the moment. The moment they leave, we declare statehood. So the 14th of May, 1948, the British left, and in the afternoon, David Ben-Gurion declared statehood. That was the birth of Israel. And as the Arabs promised, the young state didn't have even one day of freedom, of independence to enjoy, was attacked at midnight by 5 armies who came from the outside, plus all the Arabs inside Palestine. It was a very bloody war, and it was a long war. It's about 15 months war, and the end of which Israel prevailed. Now, there are many...
First Intifada?
Sorry?
Is that the first Intifada?
No. Intifada is 87. No, that's
sorry.
later. This is called the 1948 war.
Oh, okay.
Which is actually the 1947-48 war. The Israelis call it Independence War, War of Independence. The Arabs call it the Nakba, the catastrophe. Why it was catastrophe? Because this was the birth of the refugee problem. About between 650 to 700,000 Arabs had to flee their homes, and now they're scattered all around Israel. So some are in the West Bank, some are in Gaza, some in Egypt, some in Jordan, some in Lebanon, some in Syria, and some went to Canada and all over the world. But the majority of them are in the refugee camps in the West Bank, in Gaza, and around Israel. And that's one of the major problems that interfere with the Arab-Israeli conflict and with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is not resolved. And you cannot resolve the conflict without paying attention to the refugee problem. And since 1947-8, the first Arab-Israeli war, unfortunately, that region knew many other wars. So after 47-8, there was 1956. That's the Suez Campaign. And then after that was 1967. This is the Six-Day War. Then was 1973, the Yom Kippur War. And then 1982, the Lebanon War, the first Lebanon War that lasted 18 years until 2000. And then 2006, and second Lebanon War, Israel-Lebanon War, Israel-Hezbollah War. And then there were several exchanges, let's call it this way, military encounters or confrontation between Israel and Hamas. So 2008-9, 2012, 2014, and most recently...
Just 2 weeks ago.
Well, a few months ago.
Yeah.
So it's just a lot of violence. And as I said, violence breeds more violence, and it doesn't bring us closer to peace, unfortunately.
And it sort of breeds more hatred between peoples, too. Like, they're less likely to reconcile, I find. Absolutely. Tensions are flared up like that.
We talked a lot about the cycle of violence in one of our previous episodes and how it just kind of snowballs and doesn't really solve anything. But
shameless plug.
Shameless plug.
So having said that, maybe a little bit more current affairs just to help us get a broad scope of things, and then I can dive into some of the nitpicky stuff, if you don't mind. Bibi Netanyahu, longtime prime minister, I believe, of Israel.
Former prime minister.
Former prime minister. That's what I was going to say. He's recently been exchanged, and he's been on corruption charges as well. I think he was convicted too.
No.
What? Oh?
No, not convicted. He has 3 trials standing now, pending, in hearing.
So with that, then, who's the PLO? Like, how are they represented in the government right now?
The PLO is the Palestine Liberation Organization. It's the organization that was established in then the early 1960s, I think 64, around that time, to represent the Palestinians all over the world. In 1993, there was a process called the Oslo process, or the Oslo Accords, peace accords between Israel and the PLO. And as a result of that process, in 1994, Yasser Arafat, the undisputed leader of the PLO at that time, was allowed to return to Palestine. So he returned to Gaza, and then he moved to Ramallah. Gaza is near the Egyptian border. Ramallah was once upon a time in Jordan, so that's the West Bank. And he put his headquarters in Ramallah in the Muqatta, and established the PA, which is the Palestinian Authority. So in fact, the PLO controlled the West Bank. In 2005, Ariel Sharon, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, decided that he is no longer interested to keep hold of Gaza, and he unilaterally just left Gaza. He uprooted the settlers were in the Gaza Strip, about 7,000, 8,000 people there, Jews, and gave the Palestinians the right to rule over Gaza.
But they still had a claim on the West Bank at that time?
Yes, since 1967, Israel has claim on the West Bank, and Israel still rules the West Bank under occupation, Israeli occupation. And Gaza was, until 2005, under Israeli occupation from 1967 until 2005. Between 2005 until 2006, only for 1 year, the PLO controlled West Bank and Gaza. And then under the American influence and American pressure, that's George W. Bush at that time, United States pushed for elections. Democracy was very important for George W. Bush. So he wanted democracy also in Palestine. And there were elections, free elections were held in the West Bank and Gaza. And to the so-called surprise of many people, Hamas won. And the PLO found it very, very difficult to relinquish power on Gaza. So there was civil war for a few months between the PLO, Fatah is the military wing of the PLO, and the Hamas. And in 2007, Hamas took over. All the PLO, Fatah people had to relinquish their role and to leave, or they died, or they no longer associate themselves with the Fatah. These are the options that were left for them. And since 2007, Hamas is controlling Gaza. So in effect, you ask me a question, the PLO, for the time being, controls only the West Bank. He has no control over Gaza.
And does Hamas have parliamentary protocols and procedures and things? Like, do they assemble like any other government, or are they? Because the information we hear from the States is usually that they're just a terrorist group, but I suspect there's a lot more politics involved than simply terrorism, because they seem to want to actually govern.
Hamas certainly governs Gaza, I don't think very successfully, according to any parameter. I mean, if there were that kind of success in Canada, I think that you elect another body. Hamas is many things. It's an ideological organization. It is a religious organization. It's a charity organization. And it's a terrorist organization. And it's a political organization. It's many, many things.
So they do have an established type of government, though, right? Like, do they have elected officials or nominated officials and people appointed as titles with duties and responsibilities? And
yeah, they have a leader, and they have a group of people around the leader. Sinawar is named now. Yahya Sinawar is the leader. At this time, is the political leader. They also have religious leaders, because, as I said, it's also a religious movement. So they're very in tune with the religious leaders. They have to consult with them, because religion is the most important thing for the Hamas. As I said, it's a religious movement. But the political leader is the one who calls the shot. He was elected. I don't think he was elected. He was selected by the Guardia, the people who run the show in the Hamas. They decided after Mashal more or less was not around anymore. He doesn't live he did not live in Gaza, so they decided to have someone local who grew up there, who spent time in Israeli jail, who knows resistance, who knows how to fight, who knows how to tick, who knows how to hurt Israel. So they selected Sinawar, and he runs the show with his own men, with his people. But it is not a democracy. If you're asking me whether it's democracy with elected systems, with parliament and so on, no, that's not. It's a very authoritarian regime that is based on religion.
So what would negotiations look like? Not necessarily a solution just yet, but negotiation would obviously have to start with both the PLO and Hamas having some kind of consensus before they could agree anything with the Israeli government, right?
It's very difficult. I think that they have very difficult and very complicated relationship. I mean, to the outer world, that's what they say, that they speak and they communicate with each other and they have to live together and so on. But actually, they find it extremely difficult to do that. The main problem is that the PA election were held, as I said, in 2000, and last time, I think it was 2006, around that time. And since then, there was no elections. There were supposed to be elections last year. And 2 weeks before the time of the elections, Abu Mazen, the president of the PA, just canceled the elections. Now, why did he cancel the elections? Your speculation is as good as mine. But the speculation that I believe is that he understood that he was going to run the elections to take place. He's going to lose and Hamas is going to take over. Now, as you can understand, the cancellation of the election was not very popular among the Hamas movement because they could have achieved the West Bank rule. And because no elections, they can't have it. So they have many grievances, I would say, justified from their point of view, very justified grievances against Abu Mazen or Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the PA. And as you can imagine, this is one of the cases where there is a line of interests and people see eye to eye in the United States, in Washington, in Jerusalem, Israel, and Ramallah. All the three parties do not want Hamas to take over in West Bank. So that's why Abu Mazen was able to pull this thing. Because if Israel and the United States will stand against, they said, no, should be election. You declared we didn't have elections now for donkey years. It's about time. You pretend to be a Democrat. Then, in democracy, we hold elections. But of course, nobody wants Hamas nobody of this people don't want Hamas in power in Ramallah. And that's why it didn't happen. So I would say that the relationship between Hamas and the PLO are quite tense. They are not amicable. They don't see eye to eye. They're in competition, in very tough competition with each other.
So why doesn't that lead toward people trying to construct a three-state solution instead of just a two-state solution? Because that seems to me too hard to negotiate between Israel, PLO, and Hamas.
Well, it didn't work last time.
Yeah.
But
well, I can reveal to you, I am now writing a book on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's my next book.
Spoilers.
The idea behind this book is to analyze what happened since 1993, since Oslo, to explain why, despite the best efforts of many, many parties, including the United States, we're still yearning for peace, and to devise the parameters for successful negotiations if the right opportunity is going to present itself. One of the conclusions, and I base my books on this book on primary sources, meaning that I spend time in archives.
Yeah, that's my gig.
I love archives.
Oh, I'm an archivist, so.
Okay, I love archives. That's just the feeling of a paper that you know that you are the first time to see.
You get a box, you don't know what's going to be in there, and it's just you learn everything in it. Love it too.
It's like a box of surprises, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I spent time in London, in Jerusalem, in Oslo, and in Washington, in archives. And moreover, I interviewed more than 50 people who were in the room negotiating, from prime minister to deputy prime minister to foreign minister to diplomats to senior negotiators from 6 countries. So it's a major undertaking. One of the conclusion, the book is not written yet. Okay, I'm just assembling the information yet. I need a sabbatical to write a book. But one of the conclusion, true for the 27th of July, 2021, 1636, is that I support three-state solution. So I cease to believe that two-state solution is possible. I think the idea that it's going to be a tunnel or a bridge that is going to somehow connect between West Bank and Gaza is ridiculous, unsustainable, and could not have happened. It was something that Israel agreed to in order to please the Palestinians, because for the Palestinians, it's very important to be together. They are their brethren, it's come from the same people. They are not willing to acknowledge that the rift between them is insoluble. So they always claim Gaza is part of us and so on, where in practice, it's not. They are a very divided nation. So I think that this trying to insist that it's going to be two-state solution, I think it was delusional. And I say, okay, you want two-state solution, you think that Gaza would be able at one point to be part of the Palestinian state, that's fine. I'm not against this. But let's do it piecemeal. So we'll do it in stages. So the first stage is going to be between Israel and Palestine and the West Bank, and then there will be further stages. My optimal stage is first to have Palestine in the West Bank, make it viable, make it sustainable with the help of the good world, nations like the United States, your country, Canada, my country, United Kingdom, Australia, Japan, UAE, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, people who have money and goodwill, who are willing to invest in the West Bank, making it economically viable and a place of security for Palestinians and Jews in the West Bank and in Israel. And then let's move to the second stage. Second stage might be some sort of confederation between the PA, the West Bank, and Jordan. I spoke with Jordanians. They do not say from the very start we are against this.
So
nobody told me that.
This would be this confederation. It would look a lot more like how Quebec and Canada kind of came to terms with each other and decided to live with each other grudgingly, and then.
I don't know. I don't know whether I'm not an expert of Quebec, so I can't make the comparison.
What happened was the French in Canada were a lot of during the 50s. There was some political stuff happened, and Quebec nationalism rose in the 50s and 60s. And in the early 70s and in the 90s, we had a couple of referendums. The one in the 90s was very close, where it was like 51 to 49 to stay in Canada. And so since then, though, I do remember that when that happened, watching that on TV, gripping your sheets, wondering what's going to happen with your country. And but since then, Quebec and Canada have kind of that's almost a non-issue anymore. There's still people that claim we're going to leave Canada, blah, blah, blah. Even in my province here in Alberta, there's people that want to leave, but it's not taken seriously at all. And because we're all kind of just living together, we're neighbors now. And it's like, I've worked in Quebec before, and it doesn't really matter anymore. And I kind of expect that would be an ideal situation where we all kind of grudgingly accept each other as neighbors.
But I think the difference would be that the three-state option would be more of a confederate, so more like the states, where the federal level has limited powers, if I understand you correctly. And it would be the state levels that...
I don't know where you get... But I'm wondering if by confederation, that's kind of one, like these groups all under one political banner where they can sort out their differences in a parliament, say. Is this kind of what you mean by a confederation?
I mean that there's going to be different seats of power, and there will be one army and one foreign minister, one foreign relations, but the running of the things on the ground in terms of the economy, in terms of tourism, agriculture, infrastructure, and so on, will be in the local level. Now, you have to bear in mind that once upon a time, up until 1967, the West Bank was part of Jordan. But it's not something that they are not familiar with. And it's not such a long history ago. Gaza was under Egypt until 1967. That's the 6-day war that shuffled the cards and changed the reality on the ground. So I'm saying, after you established the Palestine, the West Bank, and make it viable, and make it secure for all parties, then with time, as you build more trust between the parties, you see that it's not that terrible to have Palestine.
Yeah.
I hope. So then it's possible to embark on conversations with other parties. So it's possible to embark on conversation with Jordan, about confederation with Jordan. It's possible to embark on conversation with Gaza, to have also Gaza part of the deal and so on, especially if the vision of confederation with Jordan and the West Bank will be appealing to them, meaning that their situation in Gaza is continue to be appalling, and it is quite appalling. You would not like to live in Gaza. That's my hope, and I think that's a trajectory that need to go. I can tell you that I oppose the occupation. I oppose the Israeli occupation in the West Bank. I think it's terrible. I witnessed the occupation with my own eyes. I was working with some leaders of Israel at that time, during the 1980s, and I will never forget my first visit to the West Bank in 1985, when I saw the injustice in my eyes, and I said, "This is unacceptable. I would not like to live even one day under occupation, and I don't think it's right. It's simply not just."
Well, an occupation doesn't build that trust you were talking about, and that trust is what's going to push people forward, because everyone's looking at each other side-eyed. With like, they're seeing enemies, and so they're seeing enemies, so they send an army.
Absolutely.
And I use this word neighbor because it's what they would become. And I've seen pictures of the West Bank and Eastern Jerusalem, and there's just fences everywhere, and it looks like some places it looked like it was I don't know if it's still like that. That was a couple of years ago. I've seen these pictures and some videos when you're driving around there. It looked like it was kind of everything's segregated by a fence and by a garden, barbed wire everywhere, because everyone's afraid of everybody. And the steps to this confederation sounds like a great idea, but it almost seems like there'll need to be baby steps to get towards this. And I do like the idea of them having to rely on each other for defense and for national, international relations and whatnot, because then they have to develop that trust. But what sort of, and Bill, you mentioned that, sorry, I'm a little short on breath. You mentioned that building up the West Bank would be a good step to this, but what kind of, I guess, baby steps could the people of the region take towards fostering trust between these people, besides the obvious of, not occupying each other's territories or firing rockets at each other, which would be a start?
You have to give hope to people. And you give hope to people by improving the quality of life. So you develop a sustainable economy in the West Bank. Mm-hmm. They don't have any big factories. They hardly have any high tech. They hardly have anything that you know as a Canadian, and I know as living in Britain. They don't have this basic infrastructure.
Yeah.
And money can play a huge role in driving forward the economy. And there are many, many things that Israelis and Palestinians and Jordanians can work together for the benefit of all. And this is the things that needs to be developed. There needs to have a lot of investment. Now, for investment to come, you have to have goodwill from Israel and from Palestine, and to make sure that there's no corruption, because unfortunately a lot of money just disappeared in the Palestinian Authority. So no corruption, you know where the money goes, you know where it is invested, you know for what purposes it's made, and you make sure that it goes to the people. And you want to see the involvement in Israelis taking part in this, because that's how you build trust. Because you don't want to be conceived only as the enemy. You want to be conceived as a partner. And it is possible to do that change and Israel here should be the kindest party, because it's far more powerful than Palestine. Mm-hmm. So Israel should be kind to the Palestinians, and to build on the momentum of the Abraham Accords that was signed during the past year with 4 Arab countries. Build on that and to utilize these connections to bring them forward, to do something also with the Palestinians, because the Palestinians think that the Abraham Accords come at their expense. You don't understand that actually it can be utilized for their benefit. We need to make all this momentum to be seen as something that is going to improve also the condition of the Palestinians. And this is doable, it is possible to do. But of course, for this, you need to have good leadership on both sides. If you don't have good leadership that share the same vision, it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. And if you have, it sounds like if you want to build a relationship, you build something together. And this happens with friends, and this happens with, provinces, with countries. And that sounds, so you open a factory and you hire people for their skills and not their political affiliation or their which team they on or which hockey team they like. And all of a sudden they build a relationship, and they don't care that they're shoveling gravel with a Palestinian. They're shoveling gravel with a man, and that changes a lot of stuff. And
absolutely.
And I know when I've talked about this a bit in previous episodes. I wasn't always well off. And I kind of understand in a very small way that desperation that comes with having little hope, and you look for a target. So is this what you mean by the goodwill of the world? But like we have to be open to this as well, instead of pushing one side against each other, because from the outside, a lot of times you see people seeing it as like, which side are you on? And then, cheering for a team like they're watching a boxing match, and this isn't healthy. And without knowing anything about the actual situation there. And so would foreign investment of, say, someone comes in and decides, well, we're going to build a power plant and we're going to make it accessible to everyone in the region. And, we're not going to care about who we hire. We're going to hire locals and bring in as little external expertise as possible. Would those kind of projects foster that? Or would they get bogged down in corruption and red tape?
I don't know. I think that investment, if it's invested in the correct way, in a just way, in a reasonable way, in prudently for the right purposes, can make a difference, positive difference. But first, I would like to have a vision. And what we are lacking is a vision. And if we are just a pragmatist and said, I'm going to go wherever the circumstances are going to lead me, this kind of pragmatist, then it's not going to go anywhere. You have to have leaders who have vision, who are going to say, this is what I want to achieve, and these are my red lines.
So I can tell you
what my red lines are. My red lines are no occupation. Okay, right. No occupation. It's not just. I can't accept this. It's simply against my DNA. I resist this. I can't accept any occupation. Nobody should live under occupation. That's, for me, it's a red line. So this should stop. It should stop with the Palestinians, because it's harming them. They have to live every day under occupation. But it's also damaging Israel, because it's undermining Israeli democracy. It's undermining values. You can't be a just person if you maintain the occupation.
Evil hurts.
So for me, this is a red line. Sorry?
So it's kind of an old adage that I remember where, doing evil does harm to the evildoer.
Absolutely. So for me, the occupation is absolute no. So for anyone who says, I want the status quo to continue, I said, no. I'm not in favor of the status quo. I'm not in the continuation of evil. Second, for me, peace is an objective. It is not only tactics, it is strategy. Because I want to see the children of Palestine and children of Israel play together. Until now, they're fighting each other with blood. And many people die. That has to be enough. So for me, peace is an end, and it is strategy. Again, it's something that is beneficial to the Palestinians, and it's for Israel. Third, we have to do it piecemeal with trust building. So we have to say, we have to sit together and say, okay, what do you need? Not only what you want. What do you want? I want, and everyone has the dreams. I'm not interested in your dreams. I'm sorry. We've been fooling around the dreams for too many years. What do you need? What do you need in order to have peace, to start something? What is crucial to you? And we start a rapport. We start a debate. We start a dialogue between the Israelis and the Palestinians in order to establish what the needs are and how we can get to these needs. And you find the bridges, you find the commonalities, and you do projects together, and you start with certain things and certain agreements. The Palestinians don't like the settlements. They don't like the settlements because they believe that every settlement is depriving them of their land, because they see the West Bank as their land. And they say, we are now on 22% of the partition, 1947. Okay, so we objected that in 47. Okay, so we know better now. Now we accept. It's only 22%. Don't take anyway even a centimeter for 22%. So they object to the settlements. I can understand that. I can appreciate that. So we have to find a way with the settlements. We have to find a way about Jerusalem. We have to find a way with the holy places. We have to find a way for security, and we have to find a way for the refugee problems. Now I can tell you, as a researcher who studied all these hot potatoes for many, many years, I can tell you that all these issues are solvable. They have a solution. Solution is not the issue of magic. It's an issue of goodwill of both parties.
I think it's also a logistical issue, though, don't you think? Because, like, the viability, the start 1.1, relies on, like, an entire generation's worth of re-education. That takes time. And in that time, you need to have settlements not be progressing, and you need to have walls not being put up, and you need to have rockets not being fired. So, like, it's not like we can sit in a room and agree to something and sign a piece of paper and fix it. This is, like, a psychological problem with a whole group of people, and a whole other group of people also dealing with the same psychological problem on the other side of the literal fence.
So I agree.
The viability question I find difficult, because to make an economy, or to give people jobs, or to build a factory, those people need to be competent at running the factory and using the tools that you give them. So foreign investors, I don't think there's a problem or a lack of goodwill. Any central bank around the world would say, yeah, let's all just print 1% extra money and give it to them and let them convert it. But I think a solution similar to a blockchain, where everybody in the world can track the spending of that type of donation to ensure that it's going towards buying, like, raw resources which get refined and then get sold as an economic practice. I think that makes more sense, because it doesn't build trust just on a hope. It builds trust on a public ledger that everybody can see and read and know that their money is not being corrupted.
Well, transparency enforcing trust is what you're saying.
But, like, a structural transparency, something that you can't be corrupted or hidden. Do you know what I mean? Like, that type of system, I think, needs to be part of the viability solution right from the beginning before you start anything. Because while you're educating people to use those tools, giving them the tools and having them sit there means nothing. And then hiring foreigners who are well trained to run the factories in the meantime does nothing for the people either. Do you know what I mean? So, like, the economic viability problem, I think, is the biggest problem we face right now.
I don't know whether it's the biggest, but it's certainly a hurdle. But you put a lot of emphasis on the economy, which of course is important, but it's not only the economy that matters, and the economy alone will not solve the problem.
My thought is that we've had a lot of successful states that didn't rely on those technologies that have been successful for extended periods of time. It would help, but it seems that the people at the top would need to start talking along a certain line for people to start accepting that and to implement that. So we're going to take walls down as a hard sell. But if you have the rhetoric of, we're going to be neighbors, we're going to get along, we're going to do this, and you start talking about that for 5 years, and everyone's saying it on every side, and everyone starts it's less of a, ripping Band-Aid off and more of a, okay, let's take it off together. And so then you can implement these technologies.
I think you're misunderstanding what I'm saying, though. I think the economy is necessary because it builds the things they need.
Yes.
To have clean water and water treatment plants, you need skilled engineers to build the thing. You need people who produce, like, steel and rock and cement and things like that. Like, you need an educated workforce in order to build the hospital and the water plants. And
that's the how, but the how relies on the why, and you need both of them to kind of work together. So I'm not disagreeing.
So I agree with both of you, and I think it's a process. And I said again, I would like to emphasize the issue of vision. You have to know where you're heading and what you are willing to do, and you have to be willing to pay the price. Listen, peace is a very precious commodity, and there's no precious commodity that comes with no money. Every precious commodity is very, very costly, and peace is a very costly thing. But I believe that it's worthy of every dime that you're going to invest in that. I think it's very, very important. So you have to start a process. And I said, you have to put certain clear lines, red lines, that are not negotiable. So I said, occupation for me is not negotiable, it should stop. Similarly, terrorism is not negotiable, it should stop. I will not have zero tolerance to any act of terrorism, zero tolerance to any act of violence, because this was going to corrupt and derail the entire process. So it's zero tolerance to all these things. We have to stop all this nonsense and start building something that is constructive, as Israel does now with Bahrain. If Israel is able to do that with Bahrain and the UAE, it can do it with Palestine. It's far closer. The thing is that they are rivaling on the same piece of land. And that's why I'm saying there are no angels in this story. But there have to be some sort of reconciliation and understanding that one state solution is certainly not viable. And there will come a time in which the Palestinians, in terms of the numbers, and it's not that far away, that are going to be even larger number than the Israelis in that piece of land. And what are you going to do then? Are you going to deny their rights forever? I think it's absolutely unacceptable. So it is in the interest of Israel to divide this land and to make the Palestinians the ability to prosper as they should, as the other nation should, and live not together, but alongside each other in harmony, as France and Germany. I mean, would you believe that France and Germany will have the relationship that they have now in 1945? You would not dream about this. But it made possible because we had leaders who believed in the vision of peace and were able to implement this. Now, there's no shortcuts. You're absolutely right. There's a lot of bad blood between the two parties. So it may take time, and there should be education, and there should be overhauling the entire education curricula and speaking peace, peace terminology, rather than incitement and hatred against each other.
Mm-hmm.
And started to see us as human beings. That's very vital. It's maybe more important than the economy. It takes time, but we need to have vision for this. And we have to start speaking the language of peace and to build on the goodwill of many, many people across the borders between the Palestinians and the Israelis who don't want this anymore.
So just a full disclosure, I am a Palestinian sympathizer, as you can probably tell from my talks and from the things I've been saying. But to play devil's advocate on the flip side, in order for a peace agreement to start moving forward and have some economic viability to help rebuild and have services and public works available to the Palestinian people, assuming there is a ceasefire that stands, that isn't broken, from the Israeli point of view, how do you go about with a trust when any individual Palestinian can come out and break that trust for the entire group? I think one of the other problems is we're associated individual actions to an entire group of people. And that's sort of another human thing that we all do, the us versus them thing. How do you tackle that?
There is a difference between individual, as you say, who is a spoiler who will want to derail the process, and a government or a rule that legitimizes this. There's a huge difference between the two. I want to see real, genuine attempt of all parties to stop violence. Now, if it's going to be like the 1990s, what we call the swinging door, the policy that was taking place by Yasser Arafat, that on the one hand is offering you the olive leaf, and on the other hand is unleash terrorism, this will be unacceptable. And there should not be any double standards about the use. For many years, Yasser Arafat has a dual relationship with violence. He was toying with violence all the time. So he would speak the language of peace and think that he can exert more pressure on Israel to concede to more compromises and more concessions if he's going to unleash some violence. And he did not understand until the last moment of his life that one comes at the expense of the other. That is impossible for the Israelis to have this duality. They can't have it. When you live under the shadow of terrorism, this peace is losing its attractiveness. It's not an attractive proposition anymore. But they're saying, why should I have it? I'm better off with the occupation, with the status quo. So terrorism is unacceptable as such, and it should not be condoned. So if you are a Palestinian sympathizer, you should be the first to understand that the Palestinian will get far better results with a policy of nonviolence. Let them go and study Gandhi. It's far better for them than to study Che Guevara and Frantz Fanon.
Game theory suggests the prisoner's dilemma. Basically, it essentially says no violence is ever productive, period.
Absolutely.
But the
no
problem with the prisoner's dilemma is that trust element needs to be there before everybody can benefit from the solution. And in my view, all of humanity has always benefited from cooperation and synergy.
It's hard, though, because violence is unfortunately comfortable for some people. It becomes this antagonism. This just becomes this thing that feels right. And it's born out of that desperation to some extent, and born out of, well, this is everything I know. But if we build that trust that you're talking about, sorry, you're right here. that these people that are pushed to an extreme position, being that which, by any means necessary, they become fewer and fewer of these. And then those that won't give up the violence become more and more fringe. And eventually we'll have to find a way, but it's not going to, I can't see a way where any solution, no matter how good, will end up being, I don't want to say this, but like bloodless. There's going to be tragedy along the way as far down any path. And it seems that we have to accept this to some extent in order to have a future without a massive amount, because it seems, and I'd ask if you agree, the path we're on isn't sustainable and would lead to a greater and greater amount of bloodshed in the future.
Violence, the only thing that violence brings is more violence. That's the only thing that violence brings. And show me what the Palestinians gain from violence until now. They gain nothing, and they found themselves in a more desperate situation. If they were opting seriously since Oslo in 1993, seriously about peace, and there was no this wave of terrorism. I lived in Israel during the 1990s. It was horrible. It was really horrible. Every time that I went out of the home, I'm using public transportation, I didn't know whether I'm going to return home. So living in such a fear all the time, it's just corrupt everything.
And that fear is reinforced. It's like the checkpoints, and it's like the teachers at school spouting the propaganda to on both sides too. Like
absolutely,
it right from children up to grown adults to use this emotional outlet of violence. Kids throwing rocks at tanks is emblematic of that.
Absolutely, checkpoints are horrible. As I said, it's part of the occupation, and the occupation is vile. It should stop. Terrorism should stop. We have to have people with vision who can see beyond violence, that can see beyond the incitement, and say that this is unsustainable and we should have two-state solution for the people. And I said, later on, Gaza can join, but not at the first, because I don't think that Gaza today is prepared to have peace. You can't negotiate in good faith with someone whose agenda is very, very clear to destroy you. So what you're going to talk about, how to destroy me? That's a non-starter for negotiation. So it has to come from a different way, and you should not stuck yourself against the wall and bang yourself against the wall. It's not very good for the wall, and certainly not very good for your head. So don't try to do the same things time and again, because we saw that they failed. We have to come with new ideas. We have to come with new propositions to pave a way forward. But you have to have a vision of peace.
So the corporate ideal to this would be what they do to corporations who are in this type of scenario, where they would have some type of external third-party unbiased leadership or receivership and take over the entire thing, have them all present as party to the discussions, but have an independent. And I think that's what the U.S. was trying to do during like the Camp David talks and the Oslo peace agreements and stuff, if I'm not mistaken.
Sounds like what you would want in kind of a Swiss end game, where you have one kind of national body and a bunch of cantons that are completely autonomous, but everyone can move around freely through them.
The point is just to circumvent that initial contention, right? It's just to get the peace process moving, and then you can dump it back on the people involved once it's gotten moving. And I think the West is really fond of these types of ideas, because then they get control over who's in government, and that benefits them personally, and then they abuse that type of power too. So what do you think of having third-party involvement or the West, other than investment and education and giving tools and ideas? What other things can we do as far as government and helping them get past the hurdles of emotional, combative responses to each other?
So this will be the last question, just for time.
Good. So there are three ways here. There's one way is direct negotiations, which would be my preferred way, if at all possible. So you put the Israelis and the Palestinians to talk and bang hands against each other. The second is facilitation. So you have a third party like Oslo, Norway or Sweden or Switzerland or any other country that can pull the strings and have good relationship with both parties, Israel and Palestine, who is willing to put goodwill and some money to facilitate this to happen, but they don't have any willpower, certainly not over Israel, that Israel would appreciate. That's why they only can facilitate. And then we have the mediator. A mediator, there's only one that I can see now, and this is the United States. But the United States has to come last. United States, Camp David 2000 was a mistake because it was ill-prepared, and at least the Palestinians didn't want to be there. I don't know if you read the literature, but when they went out of Camp David, they felt that they went out of prison. That's how they perceived Camp David. But it tells you what their feeling was. They thought it was a trap, an Israeli-American trap. And they felt that they were running away from prison when they left. So I think that was ill-conceived, Camp David. It was a mistake. If you're serious about mediation, so mediation has to come last after you bridged many of the gaps and you leave a very small number of issues that need still to be resolved. 2 or 3 issues max that you need to resolve, that they're not very far apart, but there's something in the middle that they could not come together. And this is where the US can come in. But the US have to come there as an impartial sort of mediator and employing leverage when there is a need. So they have many, many carrots to offer, but they should also have the stick to offer. And the United States, at least in recent years, was unwilling to hold the stick against Israel. So if the Israeli leaders is sure that the United States support is going to be granted to them, and they're never going to suffer the hardship of the stick, then they're not going to compromise. And it's going to be very difficult to sway them from their position. So mediation can be useful, depending how to use it and when you use it. It's very important to know how and when to use it. But you can't have a summit when you have 20 things on the agenda and the gap between two sides is wide and expect that within 2 weeks you'll be able to do everything. That's not going to happen.
Is the U.S. really impartial, though? That's sort of my follow-up. Sorry to...
No, it's not.
Yeah.
It's not. It's not impartial, and it's not going to be impartial, not for the foreseeable future. That's not what I insist upon. I want it to be fair, and I want it to play the role of the mediator in a fair fashion. So don't betray trust. Don't betray your own agreements that you stuck, your own promises, and be willing to use the carrot and the stick against both sides. That's what I wanted to do. Okay. And this is not going to be necessarily at the expense of the friendship with Israel. I don't think so. Because I think, and I'm saying this also as an Israeli, because I'm also an Israeli, I did not relinquish my citizenship. I live in Britain, but I'm an Israeli. I think it's for the best interest of Israel to stop the occupation and to have peace with the Palestinians. It's certainly for the Palestinians, but I'm talking for my own partisan best interest as an Israeli. I think it's very good for Israel to have two-state solution. It's very good thing to have peace. It's very good for Israel to stop the occupation.
Okay. Thank you so much for being on the show and answering all of our questions here. We wish we had more time with you, as always. Hopefully we can coax you to come back on another day. But thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And please send me the results.
Absolutely. So Professor Raphael Cohen-Almagor, we've been speaking with on the subject of Israel-Palestine conflict. Check out his new book coming out soon.
It's coming out on Thursday, the 28th or 29th, sorry.
2 days.
2 days. 2 days. Yeah, I looked for it and I couldn't find it. And I was wondering why. And I looked at the date it was coming out and I was just like, oh, it's not even out yet.
Congratulations so much for finishing, though. It's always a huge accomplishment to put something into the press.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay. Good to see you. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.